So what about the congressional process to get there, right? What's the process? You mentioned there should be a process to bring this debt down. What's the process that they need to implement? I mean, obviously changing process in Congress is very difficult, but do you have a blueprint or an idea about how that process could be changed or implemented? What
Well, it
process?
could work the way it's supposed to work, which is regular order, where the budget committee could actually put forth a budget. I mean, I literally don't know what the budget committee is doing these days because it's not putting out a budget. So they should put out a budget, and they should work to reconcile the differences, and they should put a budget in place, and then all policies that year should be consistent with that budget. One thing I would add to that process is a requirement that that budget meet certain metrics, and that you have a bunch of other changes like that automatic CR in case you can't get all the appropriations done. So you're not always working against a huge emergency on the end of the clock. But if that doesn't work, and both our budget committees and our committees in charge of our big Social Security, Medicare trust fund programs have unfortunately proven themselves not up to the task, then you can have special either groups of members who get together and work together on this, special commissions where you outsource some of the hard decision making and bring it back to Congress to approve. Or you can revamp our budget process entirely. One thing I would recommend is we should put in place a rule, point of order, that you can't pursue any major legislation with a fiscal impact until you've passed your budget for the year, right? Like my board wouldn't let me, and no company's board would let them. Put in place your budget before you go ahead and spend and borrow a lot of money. So some simple changes to the process, which could nudge the lawmakers in the direction. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of members of Congress who want to operate like this. I don't think the people sitting on the budget committee are impressed that the chairman of the committees have done nothing so far. I know there's a lot of frustration with that. And a lot of lawmakers are there to work, to do this kind of work. And so putting the rules in place that would force them to would actually be something a lot of people would appreciate. But first choice is regular order. But if Congress isn't going to do what it's supposed to do, then the people who want to step up and make a difference should come together and offer proposals and put them out there so people hear about them. I think most people in the country would say, yep, we should pass a budget. That sounds like a reasonable first step.
What about on the revenue side? Do you have any perspectives on the revenue side that you think Congress should implement?
Well, sure. I mean, as I said, in order to get us back to a reasonable fiscal position, we have to look at everything: retirement age, spending reductions, spending caps, and increased revenues. On the revenue side, there's lots of ideas. I think two that for me are the most compelling are: one, the tax code has $1.8 trillion in tax breaks every single year. And many of them don't make sense. They're regressive, they're redundant, they pay us to do things we would do anyhow. There's no oversight. The theme I think I've been saying over and over, there's like no oversight of anything, it feels like. So those tax expenditures could and should be greatly limited, and you could raise a tremendous amount of money that way. Secondly, I'm a big fan of a carbon tax. I think you want to stick by the basic principle of tax what you want less of, not what you want more of. And so trying to deal with climate through a carbon tax makes an awful lot of sense. And then you use some of the revenues to deal with either the distributional or the industry impacts that would have, because it would clearly be so disruptive, and you can't just drop it in and leave everybody to figure out all those changes on their own. But there's an immense amount of money you could raise, and you could use some of it for reducing the huge fiscal imbalances we have, and some of it to ease that transition. But there's lots of other ideas. There's wealth taxes, estate taxes, consumption taxes, lots of options. But the bottom line is, if something's worth doing, it's worth paying for. And if we want to keep spending as much money as we're going to, we should cut some of it, but we're also going to have to raise taxes to pay for it.
Well, let me ask one more question on the budget before we move on to our other questions, which is the role of the president. So what, originally there wasn't really envisioned one. It's not in the Constitution. Now it seems to be kicked off by the president, and it's part of the process embedded in there. So what do you think the appropriate role for the president is in this budgetary process, and the way that who originates the budget versus who signs off on it, who can appropriate, et cetera?
Well, I think the appropriate role, or the most promising role, is that the president has the bully pulpit, and sets the national agenda, at least has the highest level and ability to do so before it gets to legislating, but actually just to use the vision of the office to create the vision. And I think that's where it should start. Say, these are the national priorities, and then work with Congress where they're going to determine that. And then Congress is going to be the place where all the bills that have to do with financing it originate. I think the president should play a role in the process. I think the budget should be something that is actually turned into law. Most people don't know that, but the budget isn't a law. So you never have the signature of the president. I think it'd be harder to achieve that, but better overall to have the budget as a law. But I think the most important role in my mind, I mean, being the president, it's a big boy or a big girl job. Like it's not just all the fun stuff. And I think the president should be the one out there telling the hard truths to the nation. And those truths right now are, we're borrowing too much with no good reason. We have many unmet needs that we need to figure out how we're going to meet and how we're going to pay for them. And right now we have a budget that is shortchanging the future. And for those of us who believe that one of the roles of each generation is to leave a country and an economy that's stronger than the one they inherited to the next generation, we're not on course to do that. And that's how I think that any president should be weighing in to help set the agenda. Not just, I'm going to give you this and I'm going to cut your taxes here, all the things that people love, but some of the hard truths that our country would be much better off if we were willing to face.
Great. Well, let's move on to the other questions that I ask all of our guests so that I can someday compare the answers. If you're ready to move on.
Sure.
All right. Well, the first one is, and you mentioned this word before, but what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Yeah, so I think representation needs to mean both educating your constituents and then being in touch with them about what they want and representing those wants, while also balancing that with what's overall necessary for the country as a whole, and the fiduciary part and the public good part. And right now there's a tendency for people to say, like a big hot new topic in policy is, how many checks can we send to how many people? Because it's going to get your constituents to like you more. That's not good governing. That's not good representation, other than when it's truly called for. There are some instances where it is. But being able to understand, I think, the needs of your constituents, mainly in terms of what problems do they feel like are the hardest in their lives, and then working with good policy innovators to figure out how you address those. And again, balancing that with the overall needs of the country. Some things are local, some things are regional, some things are national, and some things are global. And I think you need to take all of those into consideration. One
thing I noticed about what you've been talking about compared to some of the other guests we've had on the program is you've talked more about the future than most. And so when we talk about representation, a lot of people would conceive of that being today, if to represent the people existing today, where you've brought up this idea of future generations, who represents them? And I'm wondering, in your view of representation, it sounds like for a representative, you've embedded the future into their role as a representative. They represent not just today's constituents, but the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting observation. I hadn't really realized that, but as you say it, that strikes me as completely right about my worldview, which is, again, I got into this issue not because of my love for the DNA of the budget so much, but because I am really interested in systems and how you build them in a way that are structurally sustainable and balanced and not biased in one direction or another, and work for whether it's your economic system, capitalism, or your political system, democracy. And our fiscal system seemed very out of whack, and it's only become more so. There is some commentary on my effectiveness in there because it's become increasingly bad over the decades that I've devoted my work on this, with people borrowing more and more. But yes, I do think that worrying about the future matters a lot, because one, when it comes to representation, younger people aren't represented. And two, I think the pace of change is such right now that anybody who is only thinking about this moment and ignoring where we're headed, granted, we don't know where we're headed, but we should be thinking through all the scenarios and the risks and the opportunities, is going to cement budget priorities that make no sense very quickly. And so I think you need a budget that is fluid and nimble and certainly future oriented, because I believe stewardship is a key component of both our political leaders and the role of the budget in a country, what role it plays. So yeah, interesting insight.
Great. Well, the next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And by this, I mean in DC versus their home, legislating versus oversight, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think it's probably, well, the way I just said it, things are local, regional, national, and global. Maybe I think about it that way in one way, how much you allocate your time to each of those. And they all matter probably equally. Local and regional could maybe be a little bit more together, because there are different kinds of government issues that matter there. But I suppose offhand, I think that lawmakers should be about 50% of the time connected to their constituents and 50% of the time towards policy making. Now I'm going to say 40%, 30% constituents and the rest to policy making, because policy making has so many components. But I think this is to your future present issue. I think there are a lot of issues we have to deal with right now. There are emergencies, there are things that are going on, there are things that we have just surfaced that have to happen. But they also need to be spending time becoming experts or meeting with experts on what those future threats are, so that we are building something that is prepared to deal with the ongoing growth of cyber risks, for instance, the fact that technology is making massive changes, which Congress is way behind on thinking through or understanding. So I think they need to devote some of their national or policy time to thinking about those big issues, and then how you could legislate them both on for today, and also just how to make them issues the country's paying attention to. Because they're not just passing laws, they're setting the national agenda. And that national agenda can sometimes be enacted not in Congress passing the laws, but in civic groups, in advocacy groups, in citizens themselves around the country thinking through new issues that Congress helps surface for them. So I would say a third of keep changing my numbers. A third of their time at home with constituents, a third of the time on immediate issues, a third of the time on future issues. And you'll notice I'm not saying any time for raising money, because it is obscene how much time they spend dialing for dollars, not helping anybody in the things that they were elected to do. And I would, if we could figure out how to get the money out of politics, I would be on board in 1 second.
Next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
First off, everything that they've done to put themselves in two teams, they should drop. Almost all of their meetings are Republican or Democratic only. That is for kindergartners. That is like a 5th grade dance where they're lining up on two different sides. They don't sit together. I mean, sorry, it's frustrating to me how juvenile that strikes me. So they should engage as people who are trying to learn more about the different issues and think through what they believe on them. There should be less power of leadership to make sure that they all toe the party line. You should not be able to be punished in terms of how much resources you get or what committee you sit on, whether you support leadership in some of its favorite policies or not. People are elected, they should be able to think through those issues for themselves, but they should spend a whole lot of time being educated on whatever the topic that they're voting on is. They shouldn't be able to use that proxy of, my leader told me that this is what we should vote. They should learn a lot of ideas, not always knowing, sort of like not having Republican briefings and Democratic briefings or experts. They should be done together and they could hear each other's questions. Anyhow, I say this as somebody who tries to host as many bipartisan briefings with outside speakers and things like that, so they can learn together, because I think they actually learn a lot from listening to each other's questions and understanding where they come from. One of the biggest contributors to the polarization we have right now is the loss of empathy between people and political parties. And the first way that you break through that is you start to have a bigger understanding of where somebody else is coming from. So the kinds of educational and engagement efforts that create that better understanding, I think, are really useful.
So it sounds like remove structural, embedded kinds of political or party issues in the Congress itself. And then
I
also
think parties are a
way for them to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think parties are a relic of the past in many ways. They were created at a time where technology has replaced the need for them. There's so much information available and there's so many new ways to order and structure things. So I'm of the camp, Mickey Edwards is one of the leading thinkers on this, and I'm with Mickey that the time and the use of the political parties has passed us, where they're creating more damage than they are good.
All right, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Well, as you know, from sort of my talk about the
You have
pace
to
of
say
change,
budget, right? The budget process, but.
I guess I do have to say that, but there's a lot. No, I think the pace of change is so huge that I can't even imagine 50 years the way I could have. I mean, it's big. It's much bigger than it's much bigger than improving the budget. It's improving the way countries work with each other. Like this, everything is going to become more interconnected, whether there's a pushback against globalization with the pandemic or not. The interconnectedness will continue to grow. So it's an ability to think about at what levels you need to control things, because I mean, government is in many ways to keep order in a world without very little order, to create an order that works, that kind of construct. And I think we've seen a lot of the improvements and trust and relationships come at more local levels, but a lot of our issues are becoming more global issues. And so thinking through at what level of government you govern is going to be a bigger and bigger issue. I'm not sure if that's the most important, but that's it. I don't think the debt in and of itself is the biggest issue as it stands. I think it's a big issue because it weakens us in our ability to deal with anything else, whether it's competition with other countries, whether it's new structures of warfare that bring those weapons down from the government level into the individual level, whether it's what's going on in terms of how humans interact with each other and how our brains are changing and how technology is causing them to change. We need to have a much better tool of thinking through those issues and figuring out where the solutions are going to come from than we do right now in our balkanized, committee, leader-controlled, partisan structure of government.
Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
There's just only one answer for me on this. There's so many great books I've read, but the single best book I've ever read in my life is 21 Problems for the 21st Century by Yuval Harari. Genius.
Excellent. So the last one is just about what plans you have for your own work over the long term. What are you looking to do? What are the new initiatives and where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think in the immediate, so we took a lot of the long term, back to the immediate, we do have these government trust funds that are headed towards insolvency. And too many people rely on Social Security and Medicare for this to be happening. So we're working really hard to figure out what those fixes are. There's a whole lot of possibilities. Back to those games, we have a Social Security solver on our website. People can pick their own solutions. There's no right answer, but what surely is wrong is delaying and continuing to delay on how to fix those programs. We are trying, now that the economy hopefully is recovering and hopefully we're moving out of the pandemic, to get back to a path where one, will pay for all new initiatives, and two, will put we need a big debt plan, but the best I could hope for is a modest debt plan. So we'll look at this in incremental ways on the table, try to get some improvements there. And three, the functioning of government really contributes to this and other issues potential to get done. So we're spending a lot of time trying to build social capital between members of Congress. They should like each other. They should function together. You know, we all work with people who wouldn't be the person we would marry, but we work with them pretty well and we can get over the bumps along the way. We should expect our leaders to do that too. So figuring out ways to improve the workings of Congress is a big piece of it, because we won't be able to deal with the fiscal situation unless they're willing to work together. And if we don't deal with the fiscal situation, we have a whole lot of potential pockets of vulnerability in the world that we are going to be hit with.
Great. Well, Maya, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure is all mine. Thank you.